When therapy feels uncomfortable, especially when you're going through the rigors of a narcissistic relationship, you have got to learn to set boundaries. So I am going to share a line from Confucius because I think it's very relevant here. Confucius has said that the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name. Now, I'm not going to call this one a proverb. It's a quote, like I said, from Confucius, and has some interesting bearing when it comes to understanding, the world of understanding, the impact of narcissism on all of us. Okay, now, for me, what I take from this is very layered from this line. So let's start at the bottom layer, okay? Now, a big issue we have in the world is people take affront at anybody using the word narcissist. A lot of people get criticized for using it. They feel it is too clinical, too diagnostic, too labely, too defeatist. It feels kind of mean. The correction on that is that the word narcissist or narcissistic or narcissism, they're not diagnostic. They are at best descriptive. This is something that I have said countless times. The term reflects a cluster of patterns and behaviors that hang together. Entitlement, lack of empathy, arrogance, dysregulation, anger, a need for control, a need for validation, superficiality, sensitivity to criticism, egocentricity, incapacity for empathy, and an insecurity. It all hangs together. Just like eggs, flour, sugar, baking powder, butter might hang together to make a cake. You really want to say the whole list of patterns all over and over again? And because this word narcissist is such a third rail, many people find that they have to find ways to avoid using it for fear that it'll start family arguments or get HR people angry, or you can't say it in court. It's a great word, but because of the way the world is constructed, we have to talk about the subcomponents of narcissism to be able to make our point safely. And I completely understand the fear of labeling. It can dehumanize, and it reduces the complexity of a person to a word. I get that. I understand that criticism. And if you have a laundry list of patterns that describe a person, you absolutely are welcome to list those out. But we don't ever have a problem falling back on descriptive terms when they fit a social incentive. We feel free to call a person ambitious or fun-loving or clever or even stubborn. Those are descriptive terms. Those descriptive terms are meaningful, and they give us a sense of some elements of the person. And yes, a person can have numerous descriptive terms put on them: stubborn and ambitious and kind and distracted. We can line the words up to get to the nuance of the person. And actually, and we do this all the time, we could do this all the time, we could call someone narcissistic and charming and smart and funny. It happens, it's fine. But by calling it what it is, I may actually enjoy listening to that narcissistic person at a meeting or a social gathering, hear them hold court, or even enjoy their stories because they're charming. But I'm not likely to want to collaborate with them or even attempt a close friendship because they're narcissistic. It's good to understand it all. Now, the next layer is that calling this phenomenon, that is narcissism, by its proper name becomes really important so we don't soft pedal on it. Enablers and those eternally positive people and second chancers and people who don't want to be bothered, those positive people will label it sometimes as, well, they're just difficult, or they're just going through a tough time, or that's just how they are. Yes, it is how they are. So let's call it what it is. When we use these lighter words or interpretations, it makes all of this seem transient. Oh, they're just going through a tough time. And then there's an erroneous assumption that maybe it can change significantly, or even worse, the assumption becomes that maybe this is happening because it's us. Maybe I'm the one who's overreacting to someone having a bad day. Now, of course, that's after that person having hundreds, if not thousands of bad days. But if everyone just says, oh, they're just a little difficult, we blame ourselves. I recently read an article in the LA Times where the author, and it was a really interesting article, was writing about all kinds of badly behaved muckety mucks in Hollywood, studio executives and directors and stuff like that. And the writer, she used words like bully, and they were intense and demanding and difficult and tyrannical. They were narcissists, and even the word bully didn't quite capture it. Bully evokes more of a nasty, insecure kid on a playground, rather than the more malevolent and manipulative player in adulthood, which is more narcissistic. Calling something by its proper name means that we know how to interact with it. We can maintain realistic expectations and go eyes wide open into it. If someone is usually respectful and kind and compassionate, and then one day, on the same day, they lose their job and their relationship ends and they're a bit snippier than usual, and then they do actually reach out and apologize and tell you, I had a really rough day, but I had no right to behave that way. I'm sorry. And then they go back to their respectful, kind selves. That's not narcissistic. That, in fact, is a bad day. These were people who are usually kind. Something happens. They weren't particularly nice on that day. They noticed it. They apologized for what they did. They took responsibility, and they went back to their kind selves. Like I said, that's just someone having a bad day and returning to a healthy baseline. Now, when a person is usually manipulative and not nice and contemptuous and disrespectful and maybe self-righteous and certainly could be grandiose and charming but superficial, and then on a bad day they turn out to be really mean and really nasty and then doesn't really apologize or blames you and then goes back to their superficial charm, that is narcissism. That's not just a bad day. I have heard people try to call people with narcissistic patterns words like intense, exacting, demands the best from everyone. Here's the thing, it's still just putting lipstick on a pig. It's still toxic. A primary focus of my work is teaching people about these patterns, that these patterns are rigid, resistant to change, how these patterns manifest, the origins of these patterns, the why of narcissism. And then more than anything, that these behaviors tend to hang together. And when you get it, really get it, it's like that day you learned how to tie your shoes or ride your bike. You get it, and then you never hopefully unget it. And then if that is coupled with you learning about your own vulnerabilities and working through your trauma-bonded backstories, then there is a real possibility to become, I don't know, the ultimate narcissist whisperer who finally gets it. The wisdom in understanding this is a pattern and not just someone's bad day is crucial to ensuring that people do not waste their lives, make bad choices, waste time, and stay in impossible situations. Narcissism, like most descriptive terms, describes a pattern. Yes, we all know what a cake is. And yeah, a cake can be a chocolate cake or a vanilla cake or an angel food cake. A cake could be half eaten, or it could be stale, or it could be for a wedding or for a birthday. These other descriptors give us more detail, but at the end of the day, a cake is a cake. It's sweet, it's something we eat, and that part of it is never going to change. Ultimately, a narcissist, almost without exception, is going to be manipulative and insecure and unempathic. That's the definition, and that isn't going to change. And knowing that, that is the beginning of wisdom. Naming it, understanding it, and then behaving in accordance with that understanding. And that means realistic expectations, radical acceptance, and recognizing that rigid patterns like narcissism don't change. So stop trying to fix it. And to everyone out there who takes umbrage at the word, I don't like it, I don't like the us, them, that doesn't feel nice, that feels like you're not being hopeful about human nature. I think that what happens is when you get caught up in your own sort of puncturing of your worldview, you lose the power of what we know about these patterns. The fact of the matter is you would not be tuning into this video if this was just somebody having a bad day. You wouldn't be on this channel if that was what was happening to you. You're here Because consistently, maybe for months, maybe for years, or maybe for your entire life, you have been perplexed by the invalidation, the lack of empathy, and the meanness that has emanated from a person without provocation. By labeling it and getting it, you can start doing the job that needs to be done, which is taking care of you.
This proverb, "It takes two to tango," originated in a song from 1952, and then it kind of just became an idiom. The meaning of this is that a tango, in order to dance a tango, it requires two people. But then it kind of got generalized to infer that in many things, even in bad things like arguments, it requires two people. And then it kind of goes a step further in how we interpret it. And now it means that certain things, like arguments or other disagreements, that somehow both people in the argument are equally responsible or culpable. It takes two to tango. And this is where this proverb, in my estimation, takes a bit of a tough turn when it comes to narcissistic relationships. And it is actually a proverb that is often leveled against people who are in these relationships. And this is a proverb that will often keep them stuck in these relationships. One of the most challenging patterns people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse endure is self-blame. People in narcissistic relationships blame themselves for everything that's going wrong in the relationship, and actually in a lot of other areas of their life. They blame themselves for not saying things right in the relationship. They believe the gaslighting. They end up gaslighting themselves. They blame themselves for not being empathic enough. They blame themselves for not understanding what the narcissistic person has gone through. And all of that self-blame can lead to lots of isolation and shame. Well, with zippy little proverbs like "it takes two to tango" thrown into the mix, many times the attitude people will take for people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse, especially in close relationships, is, hey, you're the one who chose this person. You're the one who stayed in this relationship. You're the one who's not getting out of it. It takes two to tango. Maybe it's about you too. So maybe this is partially your fault. And when a person who's in a narcissistic relationship hears this, too often they actually believe it and take it to heart, that maybe the narcissistic person's behavior is partly their responsibility, or that somehow they're contributing to it, or things they're doing it is what's bringing this behavior out. After all, it takes two to tango. The challenge is this: nobody is teaching anyone about narcissistic relationships back at an age when it would have been a little bit more useful for us to hear about it. Do you remember the day in school or life when you were taught, hey, there's some folks out there and they happen to be the most charming, charismatic, interesting folks you're going to meet? And they might even remind you in this really weird, mystical, mess up with your mind way of the invalidation you experienced in childhood. And then you're really intrigued, and then once you get into the relationship, they will manipulate you, and they really probably won't change no matter what you do, and they don't have any empathy, so they don't really care about you, and you will be stuck, and no one will get it, and they'll blame you for the mess you're in. Do you remember that day? Because I sure as hell don't remember anyone having that conversation with me. We are usually fed the typical Disney drivel and happily ever after enabling nonsense, but no one's ever really given the real skinny on what toxic relationships are really about. And then when you elevate this to the real world and other entities like courts and HR departments and policies and all the rest of these sort of institutions, when the time comes and you decide to dismantle one of these relationships, well, let me tell you, those institutions don't get it. And even if they did, there isn't much they can do about it. Family law, or frankly any law, does not account for narcissism. So basically, the system is telling you, hey, it takes two to tango. Suck it up. I have heard this over and over happen in court settings. People who are embroiled in impossible and difficult divorces with impossible and difficult narcissistic people. But as long as the narcissistic person's manipulation and cruelty and invalidation, and even at times sadistic and vindictive behavior either stays just on the right side of the law, or the judge or the mediator either doesn't get it or doesn't care, the attitude of the court is usually, it takes two to tango, and takes the stance that it isn't their problem to bring justice to your bad choice. They're just rather mechanically going to separate the assets and children equitably, and there is no formula to account for psychological harm, past or future. The two to tango model doesn't account for people not getting good information about narcissistic relationships. It's a big question, right? If everyone knew about this at a younger age, would we have all made the same mistakes? I think a lot of us would have, but maybe we would have popped out earlier, right? But after a person gets fully educated about narcissism and narcissistic relationships, gets the straight talk and real information, and they decide to stay, and many people do, I do tell them, if you decide to stay, this is on you. If you're going to sit here and wait for them to change, then you need to take responsibility for that, because they're not going to. So that's a faulty premise. However, if you're going to sit here, stay in this relationship, recognize it's not going to change, but maybe you're staying for strategic reasons, waiting for children to turn 18, sorting out finances, or if it's a workplace situation, waiting to get vested in a job to get fuller benefits upon departure. So in other words, you're no longer tangoing. That's fine. Lots of people do that. It's when you keep tangoing after you get the information about narcissism, well, that might require you doing a deeper dive in therapy to keep unbraiding those trauma bonds. You won't be the exception. I won't be the exception. None of us is going to be the exception. These patterns are really not amenable to change, and they rarely change in a relationship if somebody doesn't leave, right? But many people, after they get the information, they actually do step away. Either they leave the relationship, or they go no contact, or they actually don't leave it literally, but they just gray rock and they firewall the hell out of it. Even then, it means they're no longer tangoing. Most people keep in the tango because they don't get it. But once most people get it, they do stop tangoing. But since the world will often blame or use the two to tango proverb, lots of people get caught in a thought loop of feeling that they are somehow responsible for the relationship and its harms and its abuses, and they keep trying to make it better. Thus, it turns them into sort of relational Sisyphuses, and they're forever living this never-ending cycle of invalidation and dismissiveness and gaslighting. I understand why people take the two to tango stand in normal, healthy, non-antagonistic relationships. The two to tango trope actually can hold some water in those cases. If we're in a healthy relationship, we do need to take some responsibility, awareness, and self-reflection for our contribution in any dyadic interaction. And then all we can do is keep our side of the street clean. But when you are being gaslighted and you don't know what that is, you aren't dancing the same dance as the other person. It takes two to tango is a riff on the he said, she said, he said, he said, she said, she said, they said trope of who knows what the real truth is. After all, it takes two to tango. If someone has more power, if someone is manipulative, if someone is a gaslighter, if someone has very little empathy, if someone has no ability to reflect on how their behavior affects someone else, this is not about a two to tango. This is not a dance. It's a manipulation. I always say that all bets are off until a person truly understands the personality structure of the other person with whom they're relating. Until then, throw away proverbs that put disproportionate responsibility on people who are being harmed. Those proverbs just do more harm and can often keep people stuck in these relationships for a very long time for reasons of guilt and shame.
Let's talk about this idea that, are you kidding me? You're telling me a therapist, someone I'm supposed to trust, or a coach that I'm turning to for help with my relationships, could possibly gaslight me? Yeah, and this is how it happens. Some of you may have seen some of the work I've talked about. I think we might have a video about it, or I've certainly written about it in my book called Gaslighting by Tribe. That's when the people around you will say, oh my gosh, he is such a great guy. He is so generous. He's so smart. He's so amazing. And inside you're thinking, oh my goodness, I am so unhappy. This relationship is so invalidating. And everyone's telling me this person is so great. It can be one of the most isolating feelings in the world. They don't see what happens behind closed doors, or sometimes what happens is they miss the subtle stuff because they're so taken by the fact that this person picks up the check or gives them compliments. Your narcissist is incredibly clever. Whether it's a narcissistic partner or parent or anyone, they know how to work a room. That's why they're so successful. And they are very good at convincing people, which only gives them one more line of defense, one more fortification. Because if everyone around you is saying they're so great, at some level you believe, like, I can't be the only one that's wrong. It can feel very isolating to hold your ground when all the people around you are saying, what a great gal, what a great guy, he's so good to you, she's so good to us. But now let's take this into a darker zone. Your freaking therapist? Your therapist is supposed to be your friend. Now, I say this with great respect. Obviously, I have many colleagues who I respect deeply. But one issue I have run into is clients coming to my office for consultation or therapy and saying, you know what? My therapist, sometimes it's even their couples therapist, so they're working with me and a couples therapist, is saying that maybe I should cut him a break because he's busy at work. And literally the therapist makes excuses for the narcissistic person's behavior, saying, well, maybe he didn't really mean that. Or, well, maybe you're taking that the wrong way. Or my favorite, is when a therapist says, maybe you're being too reactive or too sensitive. It's one thing if the client themselves says to me, you know what, I know I'm being sensitive to this. I know I'm sensitive about my weight. That's the client taking ownership. We can work with that. But for the therapist to say, I don't know. Yeah, so what, he mentioned that other woman at work. I think you're being too sensitive. Believe it or not, that happens. We therapists are only human, and I ain't saying I got it right every time too. I have no doubt that I've sometimes said the wrong thing. But when it happens consistently, and I have to say, there are more than a few therapists, sadly, who don't actually understand or necessarily even believe in the phenomenon of narcissistic abuse. They believe that everyone's an equal player in a relationship and that everyone has to take responsibility. That happens to be a philosophy I don't ascribe to. I think that having one partner relationship that lacks empathy and is manipulative and grandiose and entitled is very different than the other person in the relationship who's just being human and wants things like connection and compassion. People then say, yeah, my reality was denied by my therapist. I actually felt crazier about the relationship, or better yet, in couples therapy, they'll say that their partner won their therapist over. By the time it was done, they felt like the client would feel like they're going into enemy territory with the narcissistic partner, and the therapist almost seemingly colluded, with the therapist often being charmed by the narcissist's intelligence, credentials, or just plain old charisma. So people might wonder, what the heck am I supposed to do if my therapist really doubted my reality? I will tell you this, and I would always be grateful if a client did this with me. Tell them. Say, yeah, no, that doesn't fit. I always have clients say, yeah, no, doc, I don't know. That interpretation doesn't fit. And I'm grateful for that. We are not psychics. We are not magic storytellers. We need someone to say, yeah, that doesn't fit. To which say, okay, thank you. And I respect them. And say, let's go back. Let me hear you again to make sure I get this. It's our job as therapists to hear you. But if you do have a therapist that's saying, I don't think you're giving him a chance, or I don't think you're being Christian enough, or I don't think you're being forgiving, or my favorite is when the therapist insists that you forgive. When therapy feels uncomfortable, especially when you're going through the rigors of a narcissistic relationship, you have got to learn to set boundaries. You have the right to terminate your therapeutic relationship. You, the client, can say, yeah, no, I'm done. And you can tell the therapist, I didn't feel heard. Or hand them a book and say, maybe you need to learn a little bit about this. But it's you have to do you. You can protect you. And at that point, please do your due diligence and do some digging to find a therapist or a coach who actually understands narcissism in a way that they can support you and be an ally for you as you go through such a process. Not everyone gets everything. Not all of us are trained to do the same thing. But the fact of the matter is, if somebody whose job it is to hear you, and whose job it should be to also understand the finer points of narcissistic abuse, and you don't feel heard, and you feel like your reality is being denied, and you feel confused after you leave your therapy sessions, you should feel a little bit more understanding. You may feel like, ooh, I got a lot to think about, but you shouldn't feel like your reality is ever hijacked. You shouldn't feel doubted. And you should not feel that there's a mandate placed on you to make nice, to further enable that narcissist and forgive, because that happens to be what would make the therapist world seem nice and rosy and rainbows. That's for you to come to your peace with. Always remember that that narcissist, even though it may seem that he or she did it, cannot steal your reality. Your reality belongs to you. And whether you're gaslighted by your narcissist, whether you're gaslighted by the tribe of people around the narcissist, or whether you're gaslighted by a therapist or a life coach or someone else who's in your life who's supposed to help you with your suffering, you always have the power to take that reality back and own it. And understand that that person may not deserve to spend time with you anymore. Value yourself enough to say, I need to spend my time with people that get me, that validate my reality. They may not always agree with it. And it's okay if your therapist doesn't agree. But they always have the responsibility to validate your reality and help you feel heard and seen, because God knows if you're in any form of relationship with a narcissist, that's one thing that's not happening in your life. It's the nature of toxic relationships. You become and you feel invisible. All of us have the right to be seen in all of the spaces in our life, especially in therapy and counseling. Why did you stay so long? Oh, don't ask people that. If any of you watching this have survived a narcissistic relationship, and usually this question comes up when people stayed in intimate relationships, this question almost inevitably comes up. And if you didn't get people asking you this one, then maybe you'd have gotten the equally bad question of, well, it wasn't that bad, was it? Now, people in the domestic violence world have grappled with people asking questions like this of survivors for years. And the reframe they offer, which is very wise, is, why do we keep asking the survivors why they stay? And instead, we should be asking the abusers why they abuse. But yet, when we ask this question, why did you stay so long? In a basic way, we're kind of blaming the survivor for this relationship. If they saw the red flags, they should have left, right? So if they didn't leave, then there must be something wrong with them. Or, God forbid, people think maybe they wanted the abuse. It's enraging to me when this is said, and it's absolutely ridiculous. One of the hardest things for survivors of narcissistically abusive relationships is how many people around them enable this unhealthy relationship. They turn a blind eye, they choose not to see it, or they soft pedal it, or perhaps even defend it. You hear all the usual BS like, all relationships are hard, or maybe they didn't mean it that way, or, oh, he had a tough start in life, just be nice to him. Maybe they're just stressed, it's work. You know the drill, you've heard all of this. Now, the interesting thing is that the wake-up call sometimes happens when other people end up on the receiving end of that narcissistic person's toxicity. I actually really am offended when a person is a raging narcissist out there and other people will say, well, they were perfectly nice to me. What the hell does that even mean? Someone else is suffering at the hands of the voice of this terrible person. So maybe we do need to take a more critical look at this person and their behavior. But it's like a mosquito. We're all going to get bit. Sit outside long enough on a summer night and you're going to get stung. The same thing applies for narcissistic people. At some point, if you hang out with one long enough, you will experience their sting. So then, after people around you may see the narcissist's rage or bad behavior, they may be more likely to say, "Yikes, that was a really rotten person. Why did you stay so long?" Now, sometimes when people ask this question, "Why did you stay so long?" it's not ill-intentioned. It's merely someone sometimes trying to understand something. Maybe they genuinely want to know what the competing issues were. Did you stay for reasons of children or money or religion? However, first of all, it's none of their damn business. But it's never a good question because it puts the survivor on the spot. And it is also shaming. The undercurrent of this question is often, "Why didn't you leave sooner? What are you, dumb? Were you a codependent? Did you just not see it?" That kind of questioning can activate the shame that most survivors experience throughout the relationship and leave them feeling even more foolish and more self-blaming. There is nothing good that comes out of this question of "Why did you stay so long?" So you may be wondering, I'm close to someone who is going through narcissistic abuse or a really difficult relationship. What should I ask someone instead? What do I ask someone who is leaving a difficult relationship? Maybe you ask or you say, "Do you want to talk about it? Are you okay? How are you feeling?" Questions that show concern and empathy, not all the blamey, shamey stuff. If you get deeper in the conversation, then it might even be better to ask things like, "It sounds like it was so difficult and so confusing. I can understand why you felt so stuck." Empathy is the one gift in the world that fits every time. We already know why people stay: fear, confusion, guilt, lack of information, lack of knowledge, children, money, religion, culture, hope, resignation. It's understandable. I know people who were given bad guidance and they were told to work on communication in their relationship, and they got stuck in one of these relationships for another 10 years. Even when people are taught about radical acceptance and realistic expectations and how narcissism works and why it doesn't change, some people still stay. But they may stay with their eyes wider open and their minds more wise. Asking someone, "Why did you stay so long?" is intrusive. And if you are a survivor, you may be wondering, what can you do under these circumstances if you are hit with this question? I always tell my clients, you don't owe anyone a damned answer to this question. Many survivors out there are incredibly nice, empathic people, and they don't want to be rude. They may respond with things like, "It's a long, complex story, and that's too simple a question." Or simply, they could answer, "It's just more than I want to get into right now." Those who knew you will know why, and they will support you. Those who don't get it will never get it. Narcissistic abuse appears to be one of those things you don't really get until you actually go through it. People feel entitled to breakup stories, to hear about people's breakups. Who knows, maybe it makes them feel better about their own lives. Maybe it's genuine curiosity, gossipy curiosity, or your life being sort of their movie of the week to watch. Maybe it is just that simple desire for gossip. But when it comes to narcissistic abuse, most people don't understand it. Many people judge it. And survivors have already been through enough without having to regurgitate their stories for potentially judgmental audiences. None of us are entitled to look behind the curtains of anyone's soul. Just don't ask anyone this question. And if you're ever the one who's on the receiving side of it, don't feel that you owe anyone an explanation. So there you go. I rarely get to say never in life. Never ask anyone, "Why did you stay so long?" At some point, if you give them time, space, and safety, you'll probably start to understand it. And also, never gaslight someone telling you about this. If they're telling you, then please listen to them. Don't question them, and never, never say, "It really couldn't have been that bad." Trust you me, I've heard thousands of these stories at this point. Yes, it really was that bad. So, there's a lot of relationship advice out there, right? Let's talk a little bit about why this damn advice doesn't work for narcissistic relationships. So sometimes I think when I'm sort of in a masochistic mood, I read the stuff that relationship experts put out there. It makes me smile initially. I'm like, okay, I guess that would work. But then it saddens me because I know that many, if not most people who are in narcissistic relationships, especially in the early phase of narcissistic relationships, are desperate for knowing how can I make this relationship better? And they read it and they want to try it. I'll give you an example from my life of how this could work. I was recently trying to fix a camera that was outside my house that stopped working. I pulled it on and off. I plugged it on and off. I turned it around. I installed and uninstalled it. I did the little thing you're supposed to do with the computer and the phone. I called tech support. They said, well, we'll have you try it do yourself. I took a ladder out there. I followed all the directions they gave me for hours. Nothing worked. I tried everything for months. Then I had to pay someone to come out and fix it. When he got there, he looked at the camera and he had the tools and the intelligence to take the whole installation apart, and then he showed me that water had corroded the wire. The original installer used the wrong kind of wire, so it had been corroded, and there was nothing I could have done that would have fixed it. He fixed it quite easily, and he was on his way. The entire experience, because it went on for like 4 months, it frustrated me, but when he came and went, it also relieved me. I was frustrated because I tried everything. I almost fell off the damn ladder. I wasted many hours, and I was told by the tech support people that I wasn't checking things right. And there's no way there couldn't have been a light on the damn camera. That was all gaslighting, right? And only after I exhausted all the options myself were they finally willing to send a real human being out, who then told me there was nothing I could have done. It was broken. He had to fix it. And frankly, my broken camera story is actually better in terms of an outcome than a story would be for a person going through a narcissistic relationship. At least my camera got fixed. For a person in a narcissistic relationship, the best we have got is, there's nothing you could do. But there's no pro that can come in and fix it. Goodness knows I've tried and I couldn't do that for anyone. So I'm reading this article that was called "The One Thing You Never Want to Do in a Relationship If You Want It to Survive." And the person went on to talk about her wonderful 22-year marriage and all the things that she does as a relationship expert, which of course are going to work for you because you have oh so much in common with her. So I wanted to figure out what that one thing was. So you don't have to go through the clickbaited hell I did. Let's just cut to the chase of the one thing you should never do. Ready? You should never talk without pausing. So I guess she was trying to say you should stop and carefully consider what you say so you don't say something hurtful or dismissive. Actually, it's absolutely wonderful guidance for healthy couples that don't need that much help. Maybe they need a little tune-up, but that's it. That one thing that she's suggesting is not going to help any narcissistic relationship out there. If you pause, they're going to keep talking over you. Anyhow, they're going to keep talking. Or if you pause too long, they will tell you that you're being passive aggressive or giving them the silent treatment. In fact, you probably pause a lot in your arguments with a narcissistic partner because you are so confused. How's all that pausing working out for you? Now I was in the rabbit hole, right? So I keep reading the article to see what the other tidbits were. Because I could see that the first tip was never going to work for someone in a marriage or a long-term relationship with a narcissistic person. The other tips were to use a turning toward policy, which apparently means that you turn toward and face your partner when you're talking to them. The others were small acts of kindness, voicing gratitude, weekly dates. Okay, again, all of this is absolutely lovely guidance. It really is. I actually think it's not only just wonderful guidance for marriages. A lot of it could apply to friendships or close family. You could even tweak some of it for the workplace. I guess you lose the weekly date part, but the rest of it. Yes, we should always pause before we talk and take a minute so we don't say something we regret. We should respectfully face people when we talk to them. Be kind, be grateful. This is not theoretical physics, folks. but it becomes theoretical physics when we move into narcissistic relationships. The reason articles like this frustrate me, because it's not a bad article, she wasn't saying anything offensive, and the things she was saying were perfectly fine, but it frustrates me because people in narcissistic relationships feel so helpless that they go out there, they research stuff, they'll try anything, so they may start with this happily married relationship expert's advice and do this stuff. Well, the gratitude and then the kindnesses, the narcissistic person is going to interpret that as like, well, you're just giving me, like, yeah, of course you're treating me like this. That's the supply they feel entitled to anyhow. Then there's that whole turning toward part. Again, it's good human relationship hygiene to do that, but they may not. And you may still be talking to their back. And if you tell them to turn toward you and they don't want to do it, they will hit you with all kinds of dismissive stuff. The weekly dates, that's just luck. If they had a good day, you may have a nice time. But if you try to schedule something like this and it happens to meet up hits that they want to do, go out with friends or do something else that they prefer, trying to keep that weekly date on a schedule again means facing scorn and contempt. So you bring all this good stuff. How long is this sustainable if it is not being reciprocated? And for many of you, that answer may be decades because you have been doing it that long. But if you read an article like this, it's easy for survivors to feel that they haven't been doing it right, that they aren't being face forward enough or grateful enough or kind enough. Again, my frustration with articles like this is that ultimately they shame survivors and they don't frame any of this within a narcissistic abuse framework, that there's even a possibility of that. People who are not in relationships who need a tune-up, folks in narcissistic relationships, this isn't about tune-ups, right? I started this channel in part because I got frustrated with the relationship shaming that happens. Are you trying hard enough? Are you thanking your partner enough? Are you being nice enough to your partner? Are you making them feel good enough? Are you facing them enough? Enough. Because all of that is with little regard for what it does to a person to do all of this in a relationship and more, and give up on themselves and never get any of the good stuff reciprocated. Until these so-called relationship experts recognize that the inflexibility, the rigidity, and the unchangeability of narcissism means that you will get nowhere and this will not change, they really need to put disclaimers on these articles. And that what survivors and people in narcissistic relationship need is a validation of their experience, permission for radical acceptance, realistic expectations, workarounds, building up other supports, and if you decide to leave, to validate that decision for them. I wish I lived in that world where it was that simple. It's not. And so for people in narcissistic relationships, stop going to the mainstream fix-it literature to get guidance to fix something that you cannot fix and that often ends up leaving you mired in shame and self-blame. I am happy for people who are in the healthy relationships that can thrive after a few date nights and thank yous. Folks, that's not this. So again, it doesn't feel good, and it would be nice if these articles could be framed in that way, but that wouldn't be as catchy, would it? Thanks again.